He's mine now. Deal with it." The words were clear, cold, and unrelenting. Emily dropped the phone, her hand shaking as her heart hammered in her chest. Her husband's mistress had finally made her move, and the devastation in her voice was enough to break Emily completely. But what was worse? Emily didn't know if she could hate the other woman, or if she hated her husband more. For years, Emily had believed her marriage was built on love and trust, the foundation she thought could withstand anything. She had always ignored the nagging whispers in her head, the late nights, the sudden work trips, the unexplained absences. She had convinced herself that life was busy, that he was just tired, distracted. But this was the moment the lie came crashing down. The tears stung her eyes, but she couldn't bring herself to cry. There was no room for sorrow. Not yet. First, she had to process the shock. The betrayal so deep it felt like a physical wound. How long had this been going on? Her mind raced as she replayed the small, overlooked moments. The flicker of unease in her chest now made sense, but it was too late. The truth had arrived, and it was worse than she could have imagined. Emily stood in the middle of their living room, the silence suffocating. She glanced at the empty space where her husband had been just hours before, unaware of what she would soon learn. Now she had a choice: fall apart or fight back. But one thing was undeniable. Her life, her marriage, was no longer the same. And as the weight of the moment settled, a single thought rose above the rest. He wasn't coming back. The woman on the other end of the line had made that painfully clear. Emily had always been the type of person who believed in the good in others. She trusted, she loved, and she gave all of herself to her marriage, to the family she and her husband had built. For the first few years, everything was perfect. They laughed over dinners, planned vacations, and shared dreams of a future they would grow old in together. But as life slowly crept in, things started to change. And Emily, ever the optimist, refused to see the cracks forming in the walls. Her husband, Mark, had always been charming, the kind of man who knew how to make everyone feel special. His smile was warm, his presence magnetic. He had the ability to make Emily feel like the only person in the room, even when surrounded by others. They had built a life together, a comfortable, loving home, one that Emily thought would withstand anything. But she was wrong. Over the past few months, Emily had started to feel a subtle shift in their relationship. It began with the small things. Mark used to text her when he was running late for work, a simple "I love you" before heading out the door. But now those little gestures seemed to vanish. He'd come home late, always with a plausible excuse. "I was stuck at the office," or "there was traffic." She accepted it, not wanting to rock the boat, convinced that the life they shared was still intact. But a feeling began to gnaw at her, something she couldn't quite put her finger on. She noticed how Mark would sometimes glance at his phone, quickly hiding it when she walked into the room. His conversations seemed guarded, and yet she pushed the thoughts away. She trusted him, didn't she? Then came the nights. Mark started staying out later, working late into the night on projects that seemed to pile up. At first, Emily had understood. Work was demanding, and Mark was always the one to take on extra responsibilities. But soon his absences became more frequent, more pronounced. She found herself alone more often than not, staring at an empty chair across the dinner table, wondering what had happened to the connection they once had. It wasn't that he didn't love her, it was that something had changed, something she couldn't explain. One evening, Emily decided to surprise Mark by preparing his favorite dinner, a special meal she knew he'd love. She waited for him to come home, feeling a sense of excitement bubble in her chest. She missed him. She missed the laughter, the closeness they had shared so many times before. But when she checked the clock, it was already 8:30 p.m. He hadn't called, hadn't texted, and now worry began to creep into her mind. Just as she was about to put the food away, she heard a car pulling into the driveway. She rushed to the door, her heart lifting. When she opened it, there he was, Mark, standing in the doorway, looking as though he had just stepped out of a whirlwind. His clothes were disheveled, his hair out of place. "Mark?" Emily asked, her voice tinged with a hint of concern. "Oh, sorry, Em. Had to deal with something at work. Had a late meeting," Mark said, his tone distracted as he brushed past her. Emily could sense there was something off about him, a distance in his eyes that hadn't been there before. But she tried to shake it off, telling herself it was just the pressure of work. Dinner sat uneaten on the table, and as they sat down, the silence between them was palpable. Emily tried to start a conversation, asking about his day, but it felt forced. His responses were clipped, as though his mind was somewhere else. Emily pushed back the sinking feeling in her stomach, refusing to acknowledge the truth. This was just a phase, she told herself. He would come around. That night, as Mark slipped into bed beside her, Emily lay awake, her mind racing. She felt the weight of the distance between them, a chasm that hadn't been there before. He had once held her close, whispering sweet words in her ear, making her feel like the most important person in his world. But now she felt invisible, like she was no longer a part of his thoughts, his life. The days that followed were more of the same. Emily found herself going through the motions: work, errands, dinner, sleep. But the absence of her husband's presence was suffocating. He was there in body, but not in spirit. It was like she was living with a ghost. Then came the night she'd never forget, the night her suspicions started to take form. It was late when Mark finally returned from yet another work event. Emily was sitting on the couch, staring blankly at the TV, when she heard his car pull into the driveway. She had already prepared herself for his late return, but something felt different this time. As he entered the door, he had that same look in his eyes, the one that said, "I've been somewhere else," and not just physically. "Hey," Emily greeted him, her voice tight. "Hey," Mark replied, a forced smile on his face. He didn't kiss her, didn't even offer a word of affection. Emily felt the sting in her chest as he walked past her without so much as a glance. She stood up, her heart racing, unable to ignore the feeling of dread crawling up her spine. "Mark, can we talk?" she asked, her voice trembling. He froze in the doorway, his back turned to her, but his hesitation was enough to send a wave of unease through her. He didn't answer immediately, and when he finally turned to face her, she saw it. The guilt in his eyes. "I'm tired, Em. Let's just talk tomorrow," he muttered, his voice distant. But Emily wasn't going to wait. She couldn't. "You've been distant for weeks, Mark," she said, her voice rising, shaking with the frustration she had been holding inside. "What's going on? What's really happening?" For a moment, he just stared at her, as though considering whether to tell her the truth. But before he could speak, his phone rang. He glanced at the screen. His expression faltered, and then he quickly grabbed the phone, stepping out of the room to answer it. Emily stood there, motionless, a sinking feeling creeping through her. She didn't know it yet, but this was the moment everything was about to change. Emily's breath hitched as Mark stood across from her, phone pressed to his ear. The cold distance between them felt suffocating, and an unsettling feeling twisted in her stomach. Who was he talking to? "Mark, who is that?" she demanded, her voice trembling as she stepped closer. "Just work stuff," he muttered, but his gaze darted away, betraying the lie. Emily's mind raced as a chilling thought surfaced. This wasn't just work. Something was wrong. "I don't believe you," she whispered, her heart pounding. You've been distant for weeks." Mark's face stiffened, his posture tense. He took a step back, unwilling to meet her gaze. Emily knew something had changed. She could feel the secret he was hiding. "I'm done pretending, Mark," she said, her voice growing stronger. "I want the truth. Now." For a moment, he was silent, and then his phone buzzed. He quickly glanced at the screen, his expression faltering. "I'll talk to you tomorrow, Em," he muttered, starting to walk away. Before he could escape, Emily grabbed the phone from his hand. Her heart dropped when she saw the message on the screen. "Where are you? I miss you. Let's not make this harder than it already is." Her hands shook as the truth hit her. He wasn't just hiding something, he was hiding someone. Before she could process, the doorbell rang. Mark moved quickly to answer it. Emily followed, and when the door opened, the woman standing there took her breath away. The woman from the message, the one Mark had been texting. "Mark," the woman said, flashing a knowing smile at Emily. "I knew you'd be here." Emily's stomach twisted. This was it, the truth she had been avoiding for months. She wanted to scream, but the words stuck in her throat. "Hi, Emily," the woman greeted, her tone mocking. "I hope you don't mind if I join the conversation. Mark and I have a lot to talk about." Mark stood silently by the door. Emily could barely look at him as the weight of the betrayal pressed down on her chest. The woman didn't flinch. "Funny how we pretend things aren't happening, huh?" she smirked. "But here I am." Mark finally spoke, his voice tight with regret. "Emily, we need to talk." But Emily couldn't stay. She turned, numb with shock, and ran out the door, the reality of the situation crashing down around her. The life she thought she had was gone, broken by the very people she loved most. Emily stumbled through the streets, her heart pounding as the reality of Mark's betrayal crashed over her. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, but she ignored it, the weight of her emotions too much to bear. She didn't know where she was going. She just needed to escape. But when she turned a corner, she came face to face with him. Mark stood there, drenched and pleading, his eyes desperate. "Emily, I didn't mean for this to happen," he said, his voice shaky. She took a step back. "Don't say that. You chose her." Mark's face crumbled. "I love you, Emily." The words hit her like a punch, hollow and meaningless now. "How could you love me when you've been lying for months?" "I never wanted to hurt you," he pleaded, stepping forward. "Please, just listen." "I've heard enough," Emily whispered, the anger rising in her chest. "You broke us. You broke me." Mark's shoulders slumped, but he reached out again, desperation in his eyes. "Please don't leave." But Emily couldn't. She couldn't keep pretending. She turned, ready to walk away, but Mark's voice stopped her. "Emily, please. I love you. Don't walk away." The words felt like poison. She didn't look back. As she walked away, she felt something shift. She was done. Mark had made his choice, and now it was her turn. The woman who had believed in their future, who had sacrificed everything for him, was gone. She was free. Her phone buzzed with a message from the woman. "Mark is mine now. You can't keep him." But it didn't matter. She had nothing left to fight for. Emily stopped, clenched her fists, and took a deep breath. She was done. She didn't need him. She didn't need any of this. She walked away, her future hers to decide. The days after leaving were a blur of emptiness. Emily found herself in an unfamiliar silence. The house once filled with laughter, now mocking her with its stillness. She wandered through the rooms, touching the photos, remembering a life she thought she had. But the truth was clear. She couldn't stay in the past. Mark had chosen someone else, and now she had to choose herself. She moved out and stayed with a friend, unsure of what came next. But as time passed, the raw pain faded into something quieter, reflection. She had ignored the signs, buried her doubts, hoping love would fix it all. But it hadn't. She began to rebuild, focusing on her career and rediscovering passions she'd forgotten. She surrounded herself with friends who cared, and slowly she learned to enjoy life again. There were still nights of sadness, moments where the memories crept back, but they no longer held the same power over her. One evening, standing in front of the mirror, Emily saw a different woman. The woman she had become, stronger, more resilient. She had survived, and while the scars would always be there, they didn't define her anymore. In the end, I found my strength. I moved on, but the scars remain. Sometimes, you have to lose everything to realize what truly matters. She turned away from the mirror, knowing the journey wasn't over, but no longer fearing what was next. If you've enjoyed Emily's story of betrayal, healing, and strength, don't forget to like and subscribe. Share your thoughts in the comments below. What would you have done in her shoes? And if you want more gripping stories about family drama, betrayal, and survival, hit that notification bell so you never miss an update. Thanks for watching.